Morro, morrau, morrau. Saying go get my cool. My cool. My cool. My cool. Oh, I'm way too far. Oh, where I'm going? We on 5, section 5, section 5, section 5, section 5, section 5, section 5. Man. Now I'm getting close to where I was. That wasn't that photo. Assistant. Where was? Preferential ballot. You know, past that. It was started with an A. Right here, it gotta be. Yep. 21. Assistant Federal Reserve agents, subject to the approval of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, the Federal Reserve agent shall appoint one or more assistants. Such assistants, who shall be persons of tested banking experience, shall assist the Federal Reserve agent in the performance of his duty and shall also have power to act in his name instead during his absence and or disability. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System shall require such bonds of the Assistant Federal Reserve Agent as it may deem necessary for the protection of the United States. Assistance to the Federal Reserve Agent shall receive an annual compensation to be fixed and paid in the same manner as that of the Federal Reserve Agent. 12 U.S.C. 306. 22. Compensation and expenses of directors, officers, and employees. 22. Compensation and expenses of directors, officers, and employees. Directors of Federal Reserve banks shall receive, in addition to any compensation otherwise provided, a reasonable allowance for necessary expenses in attending meetings of their respective boards, which amounts shall be paid by the respective Federal Reserve banks. Any compensation that may be provided by boards of directors of Federal Reserve banks for directors, officers, or employees shall be subject to the approval of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. 12 USC 307. I'm going to come back and read this about 2 more times. More than that, though. Talking about within before the weekend. Where I was. Meetings, 23 meetings of directors, pending organization. The Reserve Bank Organization Committee may, in organizing Federal Reserve banks, call such meetings of bank directors in the several districts as may be necessary to carry out the purposes of this act, and may exercise the functions herein conferred upon the chairman of the board of directors of each Federal Reserve bank, pending the complete organization of such bank, omitted from the U.S. Code. 24 terms of directors' vacancies. At the first meeting of the full board of directors of each Federal Reserve bank, it shall be the duty of the directors of Class A. It shall be the duty of the directors of Class A, B, and C, respectively, designate one of the members of each class whose term of office shall expire in 1 year from the 1st of January nearest to date of such meeting, one whose term of office shall expire at the time of 2 years from said date, and one whose term of office shall expire at the end of 3 years from said date. Thereafter, every director of the Federal Reserve Bank chosen as herein before provided shall hold office for a term of 3 years. Vacancies that may occur in the several classes of directors of Federal Reserve banks may be filled in the manner provided for the original section of such directors, such appointees to hold office for the unexpired terms of their predecessors. Get twisted up on that word. Predecessors. Predecessors. Doggone it. 12 USC 308. Predecessors. Watch me read. That's what you want to do. Watch me read. Legal definition of predecessors.
According to Oxford Reference, N, a person through whom an owner's title to land is traced. Examples are a previous owner who sold, bequeathed, or settled the land and a mortgagee who exercised his power of sale. From predecessor in a dictionary of law.
Predecessor. Now, in land law, a person through whom an owner's title to land is traced. Examples are a previous owner who sold, bequeathed, or settled the land, and a mortgagee who exercised his power of sale. 1. Amount of shares, increase and decrease of capital, surrender and cancellation of stock. Stock issue, increase and decrease of capital. That's what y'all wanted. Section 5. The capital stock of each Federal Reserve Bank shall be divided into shares of $100 each. The outstanding capital stock shall be increased from time to time as member banks increase their capital stock and surplus, or as additional banks become members, and may be decreased as member banks reduce their capital stock or surplus or cease to be members. Shares of the capital stock of Federal Reserve banks owned by member banks shall not be transferred or hypothecated. Shares of capital stock of Federal Reserve shares of capital stock of Federal Reserve banks owned by member banks shall not be transferred or hypothecated. When a member bank increases its capital stock or surplus, it shall thereupon subscribe for an additional amount of capital stock of the Federal Reserve Bank of its district equal to 6% of the said increase, 1/2 of said description, to be paid in the manner therein before provided for original subscription, and 1/2 subject to call of the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. A bank applying for stock in a Federal Reserve Bank at any time after the organization thereof must subscribe for an amount of the capital stock of the Federal Reserve Bank equal to 6% of the paid up capital stock and surplus of said applicant bank, paying therefore its par value plus 1/2 of 1% a month from the period of the last dividend. When a member bank reduces its capital stock or surplus, it shall surrender a proportionate amount of its holdings in the capital stock of said Federal Reserve Bank. Any member bank which holds capital stock of a Federal Reserve Bank in excess of the amount required on the basis of 6% of its paid up capital stock and surplus shall surrender such excess stock. When a member bank voluntarily liquidates, it shall surrender all of its holdings of the capital stock of said Federal Reserve Bank and be released from all stock subscription not previously called. In any such case, the shares surrendered shall be canceled, and the member bank shall receive a payment therefor under Regulation 2B prescribed by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, a sum equal of its cash paid prescriptions on the shares surrendered and 1/2 of 1% a month from the period of the last dividend, not to exceed the bank value thereof, less any liability of such member bank to the Federal Reserve Bank. 12 U.S.C. 287. 1. Insolvency of member banks. Insolvency of member banks. Section 6. If any member bank shall be declared insolvent and a receiver appointed therefor, the stock held by it in said Federal Reserve Bank shall be canceled without impairment of its liability, and all cash paid subscription on said stock with 1/2 of 1% per month from the period of last dividend, if earned, not to exceed the book value thereof, shall be first applied to all debts of the insolvent member bank to the Federal Reserve Bank, and the balance if any shall be paid to the receiver of the insolvent bank. 12 USC 288. 2. National Bank discontinuing banking operations. If any national bank which has not gone into liquidation as provided in Section 5220 of the revised statutes, United States Code Title 12, Section 181, and for which a receiver has not already been appointed for other lawful cause, shall discontinue its banking operations for a period of 16 days. The comptroller of the currency may, if he deems it advisable, appoint a receiver for such bank. The stock held by the said national bank in the Federal Reserve Bank of its district shall thereupon be canceled, and said national bank shall receive a payment therefore under regulations to be prescribed by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, a sum equal to its cash paid subscriptions on the shares canceled, and 1/2 of 1% a month from the period of the last dividend, if earned, not to exceed the book value thereof, less any liability of such national bank to the Federal Reserve Bank. 12 USC 288. Division of earnings. Section 7. A. Dividends and surplus funds of reserve banks. 1. Stockholder dividends. 8. Dividend amount after all necessary expenses of a Federal Reserve Bank have been paid or provided for, the stockholder of the bank shall be entitled to receive an annual dividend on paid in stock, capital stock of. Dividend amount after all necessary expenses of a Federal Reserve Bank have been paid and provided for, the stockholders of the bank shall be entitled to receive an annual dividend on paid in capital stock of
Full amount of cash or other assets that shareholders have paid a company in exchange for shares of its stock. It includes both par value and the excess of par that was paid in. Additional paid in capital refers to only the amount paid in excess of a stock's par value.
Paid in capital is the full amount of cash or other assets that shareholders have paid a company in exchange for shares of its stock. Is the full amount of cash or other assets. So whenever you hand me that whenever you transfer that application or purchase loan agreement, and you gave me assets, that shareholder have paid a company in exchange for shares of its stock, paid in capital. Okay, so dividend amount after all necessary expenses of a Federal Reserve Bank have been paid or provided for, the stockholders of the bank shall be entitled to receive an annual dividend on paid in capital stock of In case of a stockholder with total consolidated assets of more than 10 billion, the smaller of, in the case of a stockholder with total consolidated assets of more than 10 billion, the smaller of I or 1, the rate equal to the high yield of the 10-year treasury note auction at the last auction held prior to the payment of such dividend, and 2, 6%, and in the case of a stockholder with total consolidated assets of 10 million or less percent. In the case of a stockholder with in the case of a stockholder in the case of a stockholder with total consolidated assets of $10 million or less, 6%. B, dividend cumulative. The entitlement to dividends under subparagraph 8 shall be cumulative. Legal definition of the gross domestic project price index.
According to Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Gross Domestic Product Price Index measures changes in the prices of goods and services produced in the United States, including those exported to other countries. Prices of imports are excluded. Current release, October 26, 2023.
The gross domestic project price index measures changes in the prices of goods and services produced in the United States, including those exported to other countries. Prices of imports are excluded. Current release. 2, deposit of net earnings in surplus fund. That portion of net earnings of each Federal Reserve Bank which remains after dividends claims under paragraph 1A have been fully met shall be deposited in the surplus fund of the bank. 12 USC 289. 2, deposit of net earnings in surplus fund. That portion of net earnings of each Federal Reserve Bank which remains after dividend claims under paragraph 1A have been fully met shall be deposited in the surplus fund of the bank. 12 USC 289. 3, limitation on surplus funds. 8, in general, the aggregate amount of the surplus funds of the Federal Reserve Bank may not exceed 6,825,000,000. In general, the aggregate amount of the surplus funds of the Federal Reserve Bank may not exceed 6,825,000,000. B. Transfer to the general fund. Transfer to the general fund. Any amounts of the surplus funds of the Federal Reserve banks that exceed or would exceed the limitations under subparagraph A. B. Transfer to the general fund. Any amounts of the surplus funds of the Federal Reserve banks that exceed or would exceed the limitation under subparagraph A shall be transferred to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System for transfer to the Secretary of Treasury for deposit in the general funds of the Treasury. That's what I should be doing. That's what I should be doing. Uh, Appreciate you, Most High. Appreciate those energies. Appreciate those energies. Oh, yeah. So let me see. B. Transferred to the general funds. Any amounts of the surplus funds of the Federal Reserve banks that exceed or would exceed the limitation under subparagraph A shall be transferred to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System to transfer to the Secretary of Treasury for deposit in the general funds of the Treasury. B. Transfer of fiscal year 2000 in general. Transfer for fiscal year 2001. In general, the Federal Reserve banks shall transfer from the surplus funds of such bank to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System for transfer to the Secretary of the Treasury for deposit in the general fund of the Treasury, a total amount of $3,752,000,000 in fiscal year 2000 allocated by Fed of the total amount required to be paid by the Federal Reserve banks under paragraph 1 for fiscal year 2000. The board shall determine the amount each such bank shall pay in such fiscal year. 3. Replenishment of surplus fund prohibited. During fiscal year 2000, no Federal Reserve bank may replenish such bank's surplus funds by the amount of any transfer by such bank under paragraph 112 USC 289. B. Use of earnings transferred to the Treasury. Use of earnings transferred to the Treasury. The net earnings derived by the United States from Federal Reserve banks shall, in the discretion of the Secretary, be used to supplement the gold reserve held against outstanding United States notes, or shall be applied to the reduction of the outstanding bonded indebtedness of the United States under regulations to be prescribed by the Secretary of Treasury. Should a Federal Reserve Bank be dissolved or go into liquidation, any surplus remaining after the payment of all debts, dividends required as herein before provided, and the par value of the stock shall be paid to and become the property of the United States and shall be similar applied. 12 United States Code 290. C. Exemption from taxation. Federal Reserve banks, including the capital stock and surplus therein, and in income derived therefrom, shall be exempt from federal, state, and local taxation. Exempt taxes upon real estate. 12 USC 531. As C. Exemption from taxation. Federal Reserve banks, including the capital stock and surplus therein, and the income derived therefrom, shall be exempt from federal, state, and local taxation, except taxes upon real estate. 12 United States Code 531.3. Conversion of state banks into national banks. Conversion of, I'm trying to see what time it is. 5:30 a.m. Conversion of state banks into national banks. Section 8 amended Section 5154 of the revised statutes. 1. Application for membership by state banks as members. Section 9. Any bank incorporated by special law of any state, operating under the Code of Law for the District of Columbia, or organized under the general laws of any state or of the United States, including Morris Plan banks and other incorporated banking institutions engaged in similar business, desiring to become a member of the Federal Reserve System, may make application to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System under such rules and regulations as it may prescribe, for the right to subscribe to the stock of the Federal Reserve Bank organized within the district in which the applying bank is located. Such applications shall be for the same amount of stock that the applying bank would be required to subscribe to as a national bank for the purposes of membership of any such bank. The terms capital and capital stock shall include the amount of outstanding capital notes and debentures legally issued by the applying bank and purchased by the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, subject to the provisions of this act and to such conditions as it may prescribe pursuant thereto, may permit the applying bank to become a stockholder of such Federal Reserve Bank. 12 United States Code 321. 2. Continued membership in Federal Reserve System. Upon the conversion of a national bank into a state bank, or the merger or consolidation of a national bank with a state bank which is not a member of the Federal Reserve System, the resulting or continuing state bank may be admitted to membership in the Federal Reserve System by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in accordance with the provisions of this section, but otherwise the Federal Reserve Bank stock owners by the national bank shall be canceled and paid for as provided in section 5 of this act upon the merger or consolidation of a national bank with a state member bank under a state charter. The membership of the state bank in the Federal Reserve System shall continue. 12 U.S.C. 321. 3. Branches of state member banks. When we come back, we're going to get to branches of state member banks.